Okay, this is episode, what is it, 19? It seemed like a good idea, since your head is probably swimming from so many Bible verses in the last episode, that I should sort of take you through what we've seen in terms of a chronology so that you can sort of like map the verses we've talked about to time from Adam forward. And this is going to be a sort of crash course, saving you time, I hope, pun intended, on this whole business about shaking the heavens, meaning the orchestration of time. I've covered this again extensively in my Genesis video list, Psalm 90 playlist, How God Orchestrates Time playlist. All the links and all the playlists where I cover this topic are subsumed in pages, I think it's 4 and 5 of my Ephesians 1 reparsed doc, which is linked in this video description, so you can just go to those pages and start hacking away at whatever video series you want to go to. But we're going to use this video to sort of just read you in the picture and summarize the verses that have gone on, so you can place them within time and get a sort of organized picture, since our Bibles are not organized properly. None of them. The Jewish organization of the Bible and the Christian organization of the Bible are based on tradition rather than on sense. Okay? Has nothing to do with the common sense way you should organize it, which should be chronological. Now, parts of our scriptures are chronologically organized, but we sort of screw up on some of the books, so this isn't going to follow your Bible book order. I mean, Genesis 5, that's where this, timeline starts. There's Adam. The first 490 block of time was won by Adam. I explained that extensively elsewhere. He wasn't the only one who won it, but he's the guy who in Psalm 90 verses 5 through 8 is the, as it were, actor prototype, speaking for his generation. And it's not just his generation, it's his block of time. That block of time ends here, between 490 and 560. See where the cursor is moving? Cursor in Excel doesn't show up too well on screen. This is the first voting period of history, and that's the period that Moses is referencing in Psalm 90 verses 5 through 8. Moses is counting time by means of these voting periods. I explained the significance of voting periods in either Yapping Most High Part 10, which is a separate playlist, or the How God Orchestrates Time playlist. Okay. This is mass voting. This period here, to get to the 490, someone had to super mature in knowing God. That was Adam first, and he wasn't the only one. Then this period is basically everybody else who's a believer. How well do they vote to know God? Are there enough votes to know God? This is part of the trial with the angels. Satan fell, Satan rebelled, there's a trial going on, and as we saw in Daniel 10, there are rules of engagement. And we learn sort of like, indirectly, sometimes directly, what those rules are. One of the rules of engagement has to do with time. If the believer does not grow enough, if at least one believer doesn't grow enough in a 490-year period to super mature at some level, I don't know what level it is, but there is one, then the world is granted 490 more years to live. This is what is meant in the New Testament by redeeming the time. That's the King James translation, and it's the closest to what's meant. I think it's Ephesians, Ephesians 5, 6, and Colossians 4. My brain, I'm so tired right now, I'm not even able to remember the verses properly. It's in Colossians and in Ephesians, and I'll put the link in the sidebar in the video description where those verses are. But the phrase is redeeming the time. Search on it in the King James, you'll find it. All right. The redemption of time is an individual matter in trial terms and a collective matter in trial terms. That's why Israel lost out. She lost on the collective vote. Okay? This was a period in history where enough people had to vote or history would have ended. Okay? Then that began a new 490 period. Okay? Because somebody during this 490, namely Adam and some others, Seth being one of them, super matured enough. So time could go on after the voting window. Okay, that took you to 980. Okay, so you got a 490 that begins again here. And then another 490 immediately begins again here. Okay, which takes you to 1540 from Adam's fall. It's not from the creation of the world. It's from the restoration, and specifically from Adam's fall. We don't know how long he lived prior to his fall. God doesn't record that. I cover all that and show it to you from the text in the Hebrew from the Genesis video playlist. So now our second 490 after the first voting period. See, this was the voting period. That begins a new 490, and then they're back to back at that point, because each 1050 is sandwiched in the middle with a 7-year voting period. This is where the sabbatical years for Israel comes from. Okay? The second 490 goes from here, you know, so we got, see, that begins a new 490, it ends in 980, okay? Then you got your, remember that the 50 years of the 1050, you got a voting period there. That closes the 1050. The next 490 begins, it ends here, okay? And when it ends, another voting period, another 7-year voting period is incurred, and this time the votes weren't good enough. So God announces the flood. All right? But Noah had voted during the voting period. That was when Noah was alive, relative to years from Adam. This middle column is just years from Adam. These are estimated BC AD adjustments, and they're off sometimes by 3 years. I have to work that out. That's when Noah voted. That closed the period. This middle column is just the Bible's own dating. Doesn't regard astrology, astronomy, or anything but what God says in His Word. Okay, Noah votes. Okay, by the end of the 70-year period, see that's 70 years. By the end of it, Noah has voted. Flood is therefore decreed to happen, but mankind is preserved because Noah voted. All right, that's covered in Psalm 90 verses 9 through 11 as far as, you know, Moses tracking goes. So see, this is the second 70-year period in history. This was the first one. And then in between are two 490s. So he's tracking by the 70-year voting periods, and then he's giving you the testimony relative to those generations in each voting period. And this one happens to be Noah's. And that's Psalm 90 verses 9 through 11. Okay, now watch. That kicks off the new 490, because obviously Noah super matured. All right, the whole world was preserved due to him. And that takes you to the end of another 490. Okay, and then we got another voting period for, this one's for, again, harvesting the Gentiles, the precedence for it actually in the Mosaic Law. Voting period for unbelievers, another 490, and then that's when the year 2100 ends. In current Judaic terms, the way they talk about this, they don't call it 2100, they call it 2000. They forgot that they have to keep adding 50. They call the end of this the end of the age of desolation. Okay? And that's supposed to be, in their parlance today, they call that the end of the first 2,000 years allotted to the Gentiles. This is when they begin their accounting, and rightly so, except that they're off by 100 years, of Abraham. Okay? Abraham is born, really here, during the 50 years he votes. All right? And it's really because he votes and super matures 54 years early that you have the kind of situation you do where the temple lasts 40 years longer even after church starts. It's kind of like a credit because he matured before 2100. In other words, if he had matured in 2100, then you wouldn't have had the situation where the temple was still sitting there after Israel rejected Christ. The temple would have gone down. But it got 40 more years, partly because there's this credit. All right, and I cover that in the Psalm 90 videos. I show you the accounting. I'm sorry this is so complicated, but God's Word is extensive, and this is a trial, and it's got a lot of rules. Okay, so Abraham basically gets a credit, and the Gentiles get a credit of 54 years. But so do the Jews, because he matured earlier than needed. Okay, there should be a credit for that, so there is. So a new 490 begins. This time, according to Jewish, their own terminology, they consider this year 2000 instead of 2100, and they call the next 2,000 years the age of Torah. You can Google on that and see all the different versions of their ideas on that. But it's valid. It's valid because this is all Bible accounting. These are Bible dates. Nobody else's dates. Okay, so the second 2,000 years is under Abraham. All right, and so we're showing Isaac, and it keeps on going. Okay, and the 490 then ends. Historically speaking, there's two different tracks of 490, but that's going to be too complicated to explain. The historical is what we're focusing on, because that's what Moses is using. Okay, the historical 490 ends here 2590 years from Adam's fall. All right, and that's another 70-year voting period right in here. That is represented by Moses because he's the one voting. He's speaking autobiographically in Psalm 90 verses 12 through 15. That's the third 70-year period in history. Because remember, it's 490, 70, 490, then the 490 begins again, 70 and 490. So this third 70 is really taking place in year 2590 to 2660 from Adam's fall. Moses voted during that period. He leaves Egypt. He turns down being Pharaoh. That's also recorded in Hebrews 11. And because he does, he's the guy who super matures. He super matures so much, and we've got all kinds of testimony about that. In Numbers 14, God, when Israel rejected God in the wilderness, God in Numbers 14 says to Moses, "Hi, why don't I just wipe out the whole nation and start over with you and make a nation out of you?" Moses says no. Of course, God knew he was going to do that. But this is the period when he votes. This is the period when Amenhotep II begins to rule. And then, of course, this, 6 years after Moses had matured, 6 years after the voting period of Psalm 90, verses 12 through 15, okay, 6 years after that is the Exodus. It's a present. It's a birthday present, really, to Moses. It's like just before his 81st birthday this happens. Okay? So the nation exists due to Moses. Because Israel rejected him their first year out in the wilderness. So she goes wandering for 40 years, okay, before she can enter the land. And that, again, estimated based on our BC AD, but it's 2666 from the fall of Adam when this happens, according to the Bible's own dating system. So whatever it be BC you want to call that as a, an equivalent, then use it. But that's the year from Adam's fall that the Bible uses. Okay, we have an absolute calendar from the Bible. All right, and then Israel finally enters the land 40 years later. All right, and Moses, therefore, having been the third guy to vote in Psalm 90 verses 12 through 15, the next period that's for voting doesn't occur until down here in 3640 to 3710, because you've got Moses voting, then two more 490s occur before the next 70 occurs. In Psalm 90, verses 16 and 17 are looking forward with a straw man actor displaying the testimony of that future voting period. Help us, complete the work of our hands. Yeah, and why is that so relevant? Because the temple went down. It had to be reconstructed. But then there's also a problem of Purim coming that caused a lot of devastation. And then you got the problem of Jerusalem being rebuilt. This is the story of Nehemiah. And, of course, it's also the story in Ezra. I mean, Jerusalem was rebuilt before Nehemiah. I mean, that's why Nehemiah goes there. It was rebuilt and the walls were torn down. All Nehemiah did was rebuild the walls. Okay, but the thing is that Jerusalem was vulnerable. So it's really apt that during the next voting period of history, that Israel vote for God or time ends. That has always been the rule from Adam. But when Israel became a nation, she became a nation as a gift to who? To Moses, who voted. Israel inherits basically through Moses' maturity. Because God could have started over with Moses. And Moses said no. So Israel exists courtesy of Moses saying no. All right? Again, the whole theme is rejection. Because Satan rejected God, we get to be here. Okay? Because Adam rejected God, sin came into the world. But at the same time, if Adam didn't reject God, there wouldn't have been any kids. So you and I exist due to Adam's sin. Otherwise, there'd be no contest. Satan would have lost. Adam would have been the only person in heaven and the angels. All right? There would have been no sin. There would have been no Christ. It would have been only Adam. Of course, God foreknew that wasn't how it was going to turn out. But technically speaking, you and I owe our existence to the fact that Satan rebelled and Adam sinned. Or we couldn't be talking about this. There's no need for Christ if there's no sin. There's no juridical need. This is a jury trial first going on at the angelic level. Satan rejected, therefore the trial. Therefore mankind exists. Mankind sinned, therefore we're here. Okay? And mankind rejected, therefore Noah existed. See? If mankind didn't reject, then if there was no flood, we all wouldn't be descending from Noah. See how rejection is turned to profit? You and I wouldn't be here if it weren't for somebody else rejecting. And that's a major theme that's going to play in Luke's Gospel and, of course, all the New Testament, specifically Romans 10 through 9 through 11. Where Paul makes a big stink of the fact that don't be anti-Semitic, because if the Jews hadn't rejected Christ, you and I wouldn't be here. So it's a trend that starts out at the beginning. All right, so there's Noah because mankind rejected. Noah gets to be the progenitor of mankind afterwards. And because mankind rejected, Abraham gets to be picked. Otherwise, Abraham wouldn't exist if Noah didn't exist. If mankind didn't reject, going all the way back. You can see how, and so on, and so on, and so on. All right, then you got the story about Isaac and Esau. And because there was a Jacob who accepted, but an Esau who rejected, well, world history goes on because the trial's not over. That's why we exist also. I mean, if Jacob had won and Esau had said yes, and everybody said yes in those days, the trial would have been over. We wouldn't be here. All right? Same story keeps continuing. When Moses votes yes, Israel voted no. Okay, but Moses voted yes. All right, so Israel gets to exist. All right, due to Israel's rejection of Moses, the way the prophecy and the promise works changes. It's through Moses. So Moses looks down the corridor of history that God gave him to see, and he sees Israel having a decision to make about rebuilding. You're not going to want to rebuild Jerusalem if you don't want that temple. The temple needs a city in order to service it. See, we got everything backwards. Okay, we think we're here to serve God. God's here to serve us. Now that seems demeaning, but he doesn't think so. In fact, what did he say in Haggai 2 and 1? How come you're not building my house? So, of course, we don't see the bigger picture, and we think we're serving God, and that's why we had to talk about the holy meat in the fold. Okay, in Haggai 2. Yeah, because the temple exists so that people can get teaching, so they can have thoughts that please God, just like the meat burning on the altar represented sweet smell. I mean, meat smells really good when it cooks. God doesn't eat meat, but it was metaphorical for how thoughts smell to him. The thoughts of Christ in particular. That's what the sacrifice represents. Okay, well, how are you going to get thoughts that smell good to God if there's no teaching? And how are you going to get teaching if there's no Bible that represents every aspect of Christ in architecture? So, and then if you have that temple, who's going to service it? People have to be able to vote with their feet to get teaching about God. That's what the temple's for. That's what Jerusalem is for. And that's why he blesses it. Okay, but down here, you got Purim threatening the very existence of the Jews, which of course would wipe out the temple that had been built a generation before. And then even Jerusalem was being attacked, so that's why Nehemiah has to go there and rebuild the walls. And that's during a voting period, and that's the voting period Moses is looking at when he coins Psalm 90, verses 16 through 17, which say what? Establish the work of our hands. Yeah, because I got to do a lot of rebuilding. See how clever that is? That's like me saying, never mind. I don't have to identify. I just have to say those words in that voice. And everybody familiar with the background knows exactly what I mean with it. No further explanation. So Moses doesn't have to say anything more than establish the work of our hands. Somebody alive during this time looking at Psalm 90, knowing that that's the voting period it's referencing, is going to say, oh yes, I'm working with my hands. It's very meaningful because you know the background. So that's Psalm 90. Meanwhile, because we covered other Bible passages, all right? Meanwhile, going back in time again, here's Moses leaving Egypt. The next big guy on the totem pole, okay, is David. David dies at age 77. He's born in approximately 1040 BC. Again, we got to adjust BC AD. That is definitely 3066 from Adam's fall. Okay, David writes the Psalms, and it's David who wrote Psalm 110:1. The Lord said to my Lord, wait until your enemies are a footstool of your feet. Okay, he's presaging Messiah. David knows from 2 Samuel 7 that his son is going to be Messiah to rule forever. Okay, and since we have Psalm 90 verses 1 through 4, David also knows that this Messiah, see, that's in row 99, column J for Jesus. David knows that that son has to be born 1,000 years after David got crowned. That's why he writes Psalm 110:1. Messiah has to be born by that point. And Isaiah picks up on Psalm 110:1, and he also picks up on Moses writing Psalm 90 verses 1 through 4, when Isaiah crafts what meter he's going to use in Isaiah 53, which is about who? The same Messiah in row 99J. So Isaiah crafts his meter starting at David's birth, since Messiah is going to be born from David's loins. He starts it at David's birth, and he goes all the way to Messiah's scheduled death, which if you add 1,000 to 77, the beginning of the 78th year, so it's divisible by 7, is where he ends it. Now what is that? Well, 3066, all right, plus what? Well, 3066 is when David's born. Okay, so we go 3066. Let's get the calendar up here. 3066 plus what? 077, and we're going to be off by 1 for rounding, is 4143. So let's go look at 4143 from Adam. Well, what do you know? 4143 is when Christ was supposed to die, because that's the end of David's 1,000 years based on his death due. What do you know? And instead, he dies 4136 from Adam, 7 years early. That's why we have a tribulation. That means the church has to die first for the time of Israel to be able to be bridged back to and resume. And he's born when? 4103. Now, what's 4103? Well, let's take a look. Let's go all the way back to David, because this is the basis for Isaiah's meter. We go all the way back to David. David's born 1040 BC. All right, he's born 3066. So 4103 minus 3066 is 1040 BC. Okay. He's dying, therefore, at age 40, like David ruled 40 years. See, that Christ's death was 4136. 4136. Well, wait a minute. No, 4143. 43 minus 3066 is the 1077. Okay, Christ was supposed to die at age 40, therefore. All right? Because he was supposed to die at age 40, but instead he dies at age 33, we got 7 years that got wasted because Israel rejected him. So what? Those 7 years still have to play. Time is a debit. Time was promised, see? This was promised time. Israel was supposed to get, see, we got Abraham, who was supposed to mature 2100. All right. So it was supposed to end. What's 2100 plus 2100? Time was supposed to end in 4200, row 181. All time was supposed to end. The millennium should have begun here. Okay, but you got some time credits to pay off to the Jews and to the Gentiles. The first credit to pay off, okay, this is all covered in Psalm 90's accounting, is the fact that Abraham matured 54 years early. Well, 40 of that can be allocated to the temple continuing since Israel rejected Christ. But you still got that 14 that was reserved by Moses in Psalm 90. Okay? That's the first problem. The second problem is that from 4200, see, when time was supposed to end, what about the 50 years owing to the harvesting of the Gentiles? So that's playing from 4150 to 4200 to reimburse that, because that's got to play. All right, that's a 1050 unit. All right, so then look, 1050 minus 7, okay, and technically speaking, the tribulation would have begun here, but the whole total, measuring it in aggregate, is 57 years. That's represented by Passover, okay, which actually historically would occur in reverse order. Passover is 7 years, 7 days, 7 years. Pentecost, 50 days equals 50 years from here to here. That's what they metaphorically depicted. So all that is in mind when Moses writes Psalm 90, and David knows that, so he writes Psalm 110:1, knowing that 1,000 years later, after his death, his son, David's greater son, Christ, is scheduled to die. That was the plan. Okay? God always has backup plans when we don't fulfill his initial plans for us. Okay? So there we go. All right, that's David. Writing Psalm 110:1. Now, we saw David, we saw Psalm 100, we saw Psalm 110, we saw Psalm 90, okay, covering the period up to this point. But when Isaiah gets here, Isaiah's going to play off, as I started to introduce, the sum of the 1,000 years in cell J99, the predicted, completion of Messiah, added to David, so that Isaiah 53, as you're going to see in the next increment mapped, runs a total of 1078 syllables, beginning of the 1078 syllables where he ends, because Messiah was scheduled to die then. Okay? That is basically saying and reinforcing what Moses said in Psalm 90 verses 1 through 4. Because when Messiah dies, it's successfully. And since Isaiah 53:12 is worded as it is, he just escalates you all the way to the end of time. Okay? At the same time, he's also deftly saying that the period of time between the birth of the first David and the scheduled death of Messiah is also 1077 years. In other words, at the beginning of the 1078th year, Messiah is in heaven. Okay? And that's exactly what happened. Except that, instead of it being 41:43, which was the deadline, that's why we have tribulation. Because that was, the tribulation was supposed to start like this, contiguous, but Israel rejected Christ. Because Israel rejected Christ, church exists. We are the beneficiary of Israel's rejection, because he died 7 years early. We weren't scheduled, so we have no timeline. And that is something that is covered by Daniel. But before I even get to Daniel, I got to go back. Sorry. Let's go back. You got the 1077 now in Isaiah. Daniel is going to pick up on Isaiah. But before, we'll go to Daniel next. Daniel's going to pick up on Isaiah. Isaiah was covering, sorry this is so detailed. Isaiah was covering the 1077, starting though from David's birth. Daniel's going to pick it up, taking into account the destruction of the temple. Okay? Right here in 538. The beginning of 538, really. Okay? Because Cyrus had taken over at the end of the year in 539. Alright, so Daniel's prayer occurs here, at the beginning of the 49th year of captivity. Alright? And he then goes back through time in his prayer, in Daniel 9 prayer, starting with David's kingship at Hebron, right here. When David becomes king at age 30, and then he passes through all of these kings. I mean, he's real specific. He's making really biting comments about each one of these kings, and I documented the Kings and Chronicles verses that he's using, making his plays with his Hebrew words on each one of these kingships. And it's an extensive document that you can find in the Daniel video. It's going to take a long time to go through. I want to say that document's like 20, 30 pages long to document it all. It goes through all the kings from Daniel 9:5 through Daniel 9:14, which brings him up to his own time. Well, actually, it brings him up to here. During Jehoiakim, he's taken. About 607. 607, 604 is a problem with the 3-year ADBC dating system. Because some scholars say Nebuchadnezzar did it 604, some say 607. It's that's kind of a mess. But this part of the accounting is okay. Alright, so when Daniel does his own accounting, so he's dating from his captivity, and it balances to 607, frankly. So then he's coming full circle by Daniel 9:14. He's coming full circle to his own captivity in the time of his prayer. And then Daniel 15 through 19 is his petition, and that's addressing this period of time from here, well, from when he prays, okay, all the way down to here. Actually, he's even going farther than that. He's going all the way to this point, 41:43, just like Isaiah did. He's benchmarking the end of his meter the same way Isaiah does, ending at Messiah's scheduled death. It's very complicated and very beautiful. The symmetry is awesome. All right? So he's focused also on the same period, and he benchmarks his syllables in his petition to Psalm 90 verses 16 and 17. Because that was the open-ended, it should have been 70 syllables long, those two verses. but Moses cuts out 14 syllables. That's why Moses, Psalm 16 and 17 are elliptical. You know, the Hebrew syntax is like little snippets of comments. There more syllables should be in there. Okay, but they're not. They're just quick testimonies of the sort of excited work of our hands. All right? And because he's doing that, it's short by 14 syllables. Because time might not complete. Because this is a voting period. This is the third 70. Okay? And in this third 70 period, what comes after that? Christ. There's only one more 490-year period before history is supposed to end with the second advent. And Christ has to die by this point. So there isn't another voting period after this. This is the origin of the tribulation. There's no more voting. There are no more 70-year windows after this. Time was supposed to end in 4200. Okay? So if Christ didn't come and inaugurate church here due to Israel's rejection, of course we'd not be here. And devil would have won. So now when you go back again to Daniel, where we left off as far as quoting the scripture goes, when Daniel is talking, Daniel 9 in 538, and then in 537, just after the temple foundation is laid, remember the temple foundation was laid 537, Daniel 10 opens up at the beginning of the new year. Okay? And the temple foundation had just been laid 4 months before. Technically, I mean, it's treated as the prior year, but it was really only 4 months before, because the temple foundation was finished on 25 Kislev. So 4 months later, it's in trouble. And they've stopped construction. So Daniel's praying, Daniel 10. So it doesn't resume construction until 522, 521, depending on the rounding. All right? This is when Daniel 10 occurs 4 months after the foundation is laid. And that's when we find out in Daniel 10, continuing in Daniel 11. It's all one continuous dialogue in the Hebrew. Okay, we broke it up into a Daniel 11 and 12, but it's really all occurring at the same time. All right. The angel tells Daniel, "Hi, the prince of Persia, the demon of Persia, and I had to fight for 21 days, and it had to be a one-on-one fight until Michael relieved me. I couldn't come to you. Why? Because Michael's the prince of Israel who fights, but Gabriel's the prince of Israel who communicates. And for some reason, Gabriel and not Michael had to be there fighting the guy in Persia. Some kind of trial terms. I'm sure it's in the Bible somewhere, but I don't know where. Okay, well, these are trial terms. There better be enough votes. And that was the dicey thing, and that's why Psalm 90 ends on a cliffhanger. Establish the work of our hands. There's no guarantee that it's going to actually work. I mean, you believe it because of Psalm 91 through 4, but technically speaking, if the votes weren't here to rebuild, we'd all not be here to talk about it. And there would have been no Christ, because history would have ended here. See why it matters to know God's rules for time? And the meter records it, and so do many Bible verses. Like I said, I've spent 11 years on this now, documenting it, and I won't be done for another 11 years. Because it's all over the Old Testament. Okay? So Daniel, leaving off in Daniel 9, Daniel 10, that's our next up in chronological order. And then after Daniel, or at the same time contemporaneous with him, we had Haggai, and we saw what happened there. All right? In the interim, well, that was contemporaneous. Then the next guy who's also contemporaneous we haven't covered yet is Zechariah. Now, in the next increment, before we get to Zechariah, I want to show you the time map of Isaiah's 1078 syllables, so you can see the idea of the pattern of the Hebrew meter just as a sort of graphic. Because once you see the balance of the meter and the graphic, you'll know how to spot it. And I spent a lot of time showing the meter and its own graphic, its own pattern in Psalm 90. And I also spent a lot of time showing how it works in Daniel 9. But Isaiah is easier to see and understand. And Isaiah also runs from first David to last David. And if you know, most people know Isaiah 53. When you see the numbers, and you can even look up the verses in translation, you see how the content ties to the meter that Isaiah chose. So that's where we'll go next. Okay, to close out this episode, before we get to Zechariah, I had promised that I was going to show you the Isaiah 53 as a map to show you the pattern. And that's what we've got here. You can download this as a JPG file, and maybe by the time you see it, I'll put the PDF up also, because for some people a PDF is easier to use. This is Isaiah 52:13 and 14 in Hebrew, and if you can read Hebrew, the numbers don't mask the text, so you can read it still. I just, sorted the text into 3 candelabra, lampstands. And in Word, you could do that under the old Word, but you can't do it now. They changed the software, unfortunately. So this is a really attractive way to see Isaiah 53 graphically. And so the Hebrew is 42 syllables and ends there. Isaiah 52:13 and 14 being underneath the number in the text, which is readable to anybody who can read the Hebrew pretty much. Or you know what it is. It's 42 syllables, and you can check the syllable count yourself. Again, in the Isaiah 53 series, I provide extensive Word docs that you can download and all that without these numbers covering up the text. And I also did an English meter translation, so you could follow that. Isaiah 52:15 by itself is 35 syllables, and that maps to and is paralleled by Isaiah 53:10. It's a parallel in meter, and it's a parallel in content meaning. Okay, these parallels are deliberate, the meters are deliberate. It took me like 3 years before I figured out this was the meter. Those of you who know that the Muller scroll, the Isaiah scroll, the famous Isaiah scroll that Muller found, or Muller got hold of somehow, claims to have the word light in Isaiah 53:10. Maybe it's 11. I'm not sure where that word is put. That word doesn't belong to the translation. It doesn't belong to the Hebrew. It belongs to the LXX in translation. Somebody was looking at the LXX when they had the Isaiah scroll, and they were inserting a word that's in the LXX but not in the Hebrew into the Isaiah scroll. And if you just compare the LXX text with Isaiah 53 in Hebrew, you'll see that. The LXX text in question is dexeaftoi phos. The word phos is light. It's in the LXX, it's not in the original Hebrew, and it doesn't fit the meter. If you take that word light out, that doesn't belong there, and indeed, there's a gap in the scroll to show you that there's some doubt about it. Yeah, it doesn't belong. It's 35 syllables right here without it. It's elliptical text. We, unfortunately today, when we're going to assess these things, we impose modern values on ancient sources. And then when these sources don't conform to our ideas, we say something's wrong with the source. No, something's wrong with us. Okay? That's why the pericope adulterae belongs right where it is in John 8, 1 through 11. It perfectly fits the theme of the passage. But, if it's a political football, people make arguments that doesn't fit. Same thing is true here. It's elliptical language. When you get excited, you say, Johnny, to the store. You don't say, go. You're upset. there's emotion there. So you leave out words. That's what Isaiah does a lot of, because he's reporting like a live witness. It's like when somebody's watching a horse race, you say, go, go. You know, he knows what horse he's got in mind, but you don't. Not unless you know what horse he bet on. It's that kind of thing. You have to know context. So when ellipsis occurs, it's telling you excitement, and it's really important. This is a clause about the Gentiles. This is a clause about the contract to pay for everybody's sins, and it uses the word asham, im tasim asham, the asham offering, which is for the whole people. So much for the Calvinists and their idea of limited atonement. Any Jew can tell you that's a big fat lie. God has to be paid for sin. The Calvinists don't care if God gets paid for sin. They want to be able to say that only some people got paid, else it's a waste. No, it's unfair to God if he's not paid for every sin. It doesn't matter who of us goes to heaven or hell. God gets paid, period. That's what this verse covers, and any Jew will tell you that's true. As far as the the value, God deserves to be paid. Who cares what happens to us? God matters, we don't. And if you don't agree with that, well, that's your problem. All right? The Gentiles matter to God. So they're being included here. As a result of what? Israel's rejection. Mary's going to play on that when she talks in her Magnificat. So will Luke. That's why his whole theme is reversal. That's why he keeps reversing the order of Matthew. And you're going to see that even more when we get to Luke 4. So look. 42 syllables. 42 syllables ending chapter 53. And then my favorite verse is below. 54:1, which is a conclusion of chapter 53. Okay. Moses used 84 syllables as a decree. Okay. Isaiah splits that decree to begin and end Isaiah 53. Because why? Because it's a decree about Messiah and how Messiah is going to turn out. And specifically, Isaiah 53:12, which is highlighted in dark blue now, and Isaiah 52:13 and 14 are the decree concerning the Jews. With us Gentiles, get this, just like Paul will later say in Romans 11, we get included, encapsulated, sewn up between, see, this is 1 David, 42 syllables worth of 1 David. This is the death of the last David and the ultimate outcome at the end of time. In between is the phrase about the Gentile prophecy being included. The people who never heard of him will know him. That's us, the Gentiles. That's why Christ could claim church built upon Christ, not Peter. Hello. Golly, did they flunk first-year Greek, the church fathers? You have to flunk first-year Greek to think that Peter is the rock that's meant in Matthew 16:18. You really do. You flunk first-year Greek. You should just go start over. This is a prophecy to the Gentiles. Christ is invoking it in Matthew 16:18, based on Isaiah 52:15. So Luke invokes it to show why church is getting inserted. That's why Paul writes Romans 11. That's why Isaiah 52:15 sums up David, because David's role was to produce the last David, so that the whole world could be saved. Hello. So what would Isaiah do to balance that? This is all rhetorical style. There's no secret codes here. It's just flat rhetorical, good poetry, good style. That's the contract to pay for sins. Verse 10, Isaiah 53:10. If you will make your soul, a substitute for sins. Intasim Hasham nafsho. For sins, all sins, not some sins. So the Calvinists flunked Theology 101. They also flunked Hebrew 101. There are no sins excluded here that Christ didn't pay for, because God deserves to be paid for all sin. Hello. Notice how it offsets the 35 on the left-hand side of the screen. In between, we got starting at our dear boy, Hezekiah, because we got the ellipsis right in here. We got a little ellipsis here of 252 years. So that brings us to 712 BC, and that's going to Hezekiah and Manasseh. It's because of Manasseh that the first temple will go down. Manasseh ends up going in chains. He repents. He comes back. He cleans the temple, but Israel is still rebellious. That takes you down, and you got to keep going. That's 35 syllables. And then the other 35 syllables take you to 586 BC, where it says 203 right here. This 203 is 586 BC from 712. Okay? That takes you through Josiah and the deportations and Daniel being deported right down here at 586 BC. Okay? The Jeconiah deportation, what was it? 592 in Ezekiel, or 597, I forget. Okay. And then by the time you get down here, that's Daniel. Daniel's praying. It's Hifki, not Yifki. Yehoah Hifki. That's just after Hifki right here. Let me see if I can. Just right here. See where that little light blue is that I'm playing with? That's where Daniel prays. That's the 49th year of captivity at its beginning. And then the rest of this takes you to 529, 530, I forget which, when Cyrus dies. So, at the end of Isaiah 53:6, Cyrus dies. See, the Jews memorized the Hebrew. So they were getting a year by year, blow by blow. Here's where you are on the time map. Shaking the heavens. I mean, time shakes the heavens. This whole thing is about time. Deuteronomy 32:8. All time is based on the Jews. Still, church is here to help the Jews. We're folded in. See, the decree begins and ends with who? Messiah. Who is Messiah? A Jew. The Jew around whom all time is designed. And that is in the book of Hebrews, Hebrews 1:3. I think they mistranslated worlds in English. Around whom he designed the world. It's not worlds, it's time. It's aionios in the Greek. It means time. Alright, and we're sandwiched right in here. And right in here, we Gentiles. So now we're on Gentile time. Church. Any Jew who believes in Christ, even if he calls himself a Jew, keeps on observing the law, even though that's not the contract anymore, he's still saved. He's just mixed up about what spiritual covenant is operating now. Post-salvation. Mosaic law was a post-salvation covenant that ended when Messiah died, and a new covenant came in. That's the theme of the book of Hebrews, explaining why the changeover. But Luke explains it first by using reversal techniques in his gospel, telling the same story with an emphasis on little rhetorical styles that tell you things that if you were alive then, you would have picked up on right away. Okay? Just like, never mind. Would make immediate sense to somebody who was a fan of Saturday Night Live. Alright? So Cyrus is dead here. Civil war, therefore, begins. And it sort of began a couple years earlier. See, Daniel prays here. That's Daniel 9. Then this is the Hebrew word bo, meaning to go or to enter. And this is the at sign, the Hebrew object marker. Okay? And this is our sins going on to him. Okay? Kolanu, of all of us. Alright? At that point, Cyrus is dead. But before he dies, this is Daniel praying, Daniel 9. This is the following year, Daniel 10. See, Daniel's tracking to this, and if you watch the videos on his meter, you'll see that. This is the object marker, and you concatenate this as one syllable. It's boet. It's really, if you say it fast, it's one syllable. And this is awon. Sins. Daniel is dead somewhere in here. somewhere between here and here. And then at Kulanu, last 3 years, the end of this, Cyrus dies. So during this 3-year period, see, the temple, while Daniel was still alive, we had a problem with the temple right here. Okay? Or here, depending on how you want to count the syllables. Alright? That's temple trouble. Cyrus is still alive, but he's out on campaign in Egypt. So he can't manage the political brouhaha back home. And Cambyses either couldn't manage it or didn't want to, or I don't know the story on Cambyses. But the last 3 years, at some time during that last 3 years, Cambyses went and joined his dad. His dad dies, then Cambyses dies. So we got a civil war going on for the next 7 years here, which Isaiah specifically tracks. That takes you to 522 BC when what? When our boy Darius the Great takes power. That covers the next 7 years, and the temple's being rebuilt during this time. Now, look at the text. Okay? This first text, this is civil war. Nigas wahuna'ani. Is that apt or what? Okay? That he was oppressed. I forget how it's translated in English. What would be a good way to translate that? I think they translated something like afflicted and oppressed. I hate those words because they're such fuzzball words. It means he was beaten up, and na'ani here is often a keyword used for rape, like in the rape of Tamar. Okay? And then Walo Yiftach View, they kept their mouth shut. Yeah, see, this is when the temple's being built now. Darius the Great has ordered that the temple continue. So there's nothing to say. We're keeping quiet and working. They're keeping quiet about the abuse that they suffered. And God delivered them. Darius the Great is in power. I mean, they knew this as their calendar. Can you imagine them focusing on this verse and musing over how apt the meaning, though it applies to Messiah, ostensibly and truly, it also applies to their rebuilding time. And it just goes like that. I mean, this is already past an hour, and I know how people get bored, and I get tired too. But the text tracks the time. I mean, this verse right here, this one, temple goes down, and I'll try to cut it here. Okay? I think they translate that in English, smitten by God and afflicted. But it really means violated. God violated, like a rape. I mean, you have to treat the temple. I mean, a destruction of the temple is like the rape of a woman, okay? So rape's a good term. And the ani is exactly the word that's used here. And that's what was going on. The temple was down still. And Persia was at civil war, nani. When you have civil war, there's a lot of rape. Okay? And I mean, it's got other meanings. The heart of it is a taskmaster ordering you by voice. But it's got a lot of other meanings. Just go look it up in a good Hebrew lexicon. It's got several different families of meanings. Ana is the vocabulary form of the verb. Okay? And then the rest of the history going down to where we just saw on that time map I showed you. This takes you to 460 BC, which was the end of the 490-year time grant given the first temple. So now time is balanced. Okay? And then that takes you, it is between 10 and 11. That's 460 BC at the end of this 329 marker here. That's 460. And then the rebuilding of Jerusalem is coming up with Nehemiah and all that, which I haven't covered. Okay, that's the next 56 years. And as a result of that, temple time is restored. And that should take you, 460 and 56? Yeah, because that ties to, or 63 rather. And that ties to balance of Psalm 90, verse 17. Okay, so in the 364 years the temple stood is reimbursed here, which Daniel references in his meter. and the clock starts up again, and by the time you get here, it's 5 BC. And that's where Mary's going to pick it up. Okay, and there's 42 syllables left, so she's claiming this section, okay, when she talks about generations. And we're going to see all that after we finish all this lead up to her. Now, after this comes Zechariah, because I've got to show where Zechariah feeds into Haggai to show you more about the whole interplay with Darius the Great. Again, all this is prelude to show how we know from Luke that it's Hanukkah, and how we know from Magnificat that Mary knows it's Hanukkah, because she's quoting that section of Haggai which relates to what would become Hanukkah.